This video is an introduction to topic 2 of paper 1, UK government and politics, which is electoral systems and referendums. And this video will focus on first past the post, the most recognisable electoral system used in the United Kingdom, and that is because it is used for UK general elections. The term first past the post is a horse racing term because essentially the candidate with more votes than anybody else becomes the representative. You do not need a majority in first past the post, just more than the second place, hence the horse racing comparison. What we're going to do in this video is we're going to look at the characteristics of first past the post and some of the positive and negative impacts that this system has on our politics. One thing that the exam board that we use, AQA, insists on for this topic is that students look at 3 case studies. One of those case studies is going to be the 2019 general election. And we're just going to very briefly go through the key sort of consequences of that result. On the left, you can see the result across the United Kingdom. We can see that the Conservatives nationwide across the entirety of the UK are the most popular party, but the majority of their support comes from England and Wales, some limited support in Scotland. We can see that in Scotland, the majority party by quite some way is the Scottish Nationalist Party. And then in Northern Ireland, you can see the green and red representing Sinn Féin and the Democratic Unionist Party, the main nationalist and unionist parties in Northern Ireland. What's interesting about this graph is that quite often the graph that most people will see is the one on the left. That is constituency sizes. And when you look at that, it looks as if the Conservative Party are picking up 60-75% of the seats. The map is awash with blue. When we start to look at the other versions, we will see how maybe the geographical map is misleading in some ways, because the middle version of the map looks at every constituency as if it was of equal size. And so we're not looking there at the geographical boundaries because quite often in conservative areas of the country or conservative voting areas of the country, you've actually got a huge area of land with the same amount of people or a similar amount of people to some of the constituencies in the cities. So when we look at the middle map, we can see that Labour's support tends to come in the City of London and in South Wales and in areas of the Northwest, Yorkshire and the Northeast. There's some support here in the Midlands too. So we're starting to get an idea of where the Labour Party wins seats when we look at the map as well. Then finally, the map on the right of the image is the map of the United Kingdom by population. So areas where the population is high, the map swells, and where it is low, the map begins to shrink. So if you look on the first version of the map, if we look at just the East Coast for a moment, you just see essentially a sea of blue, and then next to it, this little sort of central cauldron of red. But when we look at it by population, you can actually see that because the population of London and Greater London and surrounding areas is so high, we can see that by population, the map changes quite dramatically. And another general rule, and we'll come to this when we talk about voting behaviour in more detail, is that in the urban areas with a higher population, the Labour Party tends to do better and the Conservatives tend to win in more rural seats. So in 2019, we get quite a significant victory for the Conservatives, and I'll very briefly go over some of my reaction to that now. So these are extracts from a document that my classes will all receive. We're going to look at my immediate reaction to the election result, then we'll look at where the election was won and lost, and then finally some results in the area local to Bolton. So the shock in 2019 was not that the Conservatives beat Labour, but the scale of the victory. Boris Johnson was able to have more than an 80-seat majority in the House of Commons, which people were not expecting. This was Labour's worst performance in well over 80 years. It was a disaster for the Labour Party. It was the beginning of the end for Jeremy Corbyn. And the key reason why the Conservatives won this election was because it managed to make the election about Brexit. We're going to look at how people voted in 2019 based on their Brexit preferences in just a moment. But basically, the so-called red wall seats, these northern, traditionally Labour seats that supported Brexit, flipped. And many of them voted Conservative, in some cases for the first time ever. And that was why Boris Johnson and the Conservatives were able to get a surprise 80-plus seat majority. And as part of their focus group activities before the election, the Conservatives decided that they were going to target the so-called Workington man. And the Workington man was the typical voter the Tories were trying to win over. So Workington man lived in a traditional Labour seat, was not overly affluent, was generally white, male, and Brexit voting. And it was, how can we convince these northern traditional Labour voters to turn their backs on the Labour Party and vote for the Conservatives? And a big part of it was the message that Boris Johnson was sending to the people of Britain, which was, we will get Brexit done. We are the party, the only party that can make a success of Brexit, and I have a deal ready. Boris Johnson referred to it as an oven-ready deal. I have a deal ready that's good for Britain that the EU will agree to. So let's take a quick look at turnout, and then we'll talk about results based on Brexit and in the area surrounding Bolton. Turnout was actually down in 2019. It was down to 67%. It had fell 1.5 percentage points. The nation most likely to vote was Scotland, and the nation least likely to vote was Northern Ireland. In Scotland, turnout was 68%. Northern Ireland, just shy of 62%. So we call this the Brexit election, and we can see why. Now, Conservative voters, Leave voters were more likely to vote Conservative this time around than they had been previously. So in 2017, those who'd voted for Brexit, who were not convinced by Theresa May and her politics, were more convinced by Boris Johnson. So those who identified as a strong Leave supporter, that those people were 6 percentage points more likely to vote Conservative in 2019 than they had been in 2017. Those strong Leave voters abandoned Labour. You can see that Labour's vote share fell over 10 percentage points with those people that called themselves strong Leave voters. And that idea of the Workington man, the Northerners living in traditional Labour seats, they make up a lot of that 10% drop for the Labour Party. You can actually see that, strangely enough, strong Leave voters, actually, that they were more likely to vote Lib Dem this time around. And what's interesting at this point in 2019 is the Lib Dems were promising to revoke Brexit altogether. So it seems to be that the only party that suffered in 2019 from Brexit voters was the Labour Party. If we look at Remain voters, there was a big gain for the Lib Dems, nearly 5%, because they were the only party promising to cancel and put a stop to Brexit. But what's more interesting for me is that those that called themselves strong Remain voters were more likely to abandon the Labour Party than the Conservative Party. And the reason for that is because it seemed to be that for many Leave voters, for many Remain voters, they were resigned to Brexit happening. They didn't agree with it, but they accepted the decision that had been made and just wanted Brexit over and done with so that British politics and the British people could move on. And it was seen that the Conservatives had a clear plan and a clear direction for Brexit, whereas under Jeremy Corbyn, the Labour Party did not. So the Labour Party dropped significantly with both Leave and Remainers, whereas the Conservative gained with Leave voters, small losses with Remainers. Interestingly, that the Lib Dems, the Brexit Party and the Greens all gained with both Leave and Remain voters. So in the Brexit election, it was the Labour Party that were the biggest losers. So, well done to Boris Johnson in 2019, who managed to smash the so-called Red Wall, these traditional Labour seats, mostly in the north, that voted in favour of Brexit, flipped to the Conservatives in some cases for the first time. So let's look at the results in and around Bolton. So first of all, we've got Bolton is split into North East, South East and West. In the North East, the Conservative candidate Mark Logan won by less than 400 votes. And it seems as though the Bolton North East has become a battleground seat for the foreseeable future. Bolton South East stayed Labour. So North East went from red to blue, South East stayed red. Yasmin Qureshi held on to her seat, but the vote share did fall 8%. Quite a safe majority, 7,500 votes ahead of the Conservatives in second. The Brexit Party were a big presence there, finishing third with 3,000 votes. And then in the West, at the time, it was before the election, the only Conservative seat in Bolton. It's now one of two. Chris Green increased his majority, and the Labour candidate Julie Hilling, who was once MP for the region, her vote share fell 9%. And one thing that was interesting is, if we look at what the Brexit Party did, is they stood a candidate in Bolton South East, but not in Bolton West. And that was a tactical decision by the Brexit Party. What the Brexit Party knew is that they couldn't win the election, because first past the post gives us two big parties, the Conservatives and Labour Party, and only those two have a realistic chance of forming a government. So what we get instead is the Brexit Party try and spoil the election for Labour. So the Brexit Party didn't put a candidate up in Bolton West, and the idea is that any Brexit voters in Bolton West only really have the Conservatives as an option if Brexit is their main priority when they go to vote. In South East, because it's a sitting Labour MP, the idea was that those Labour voters who couldn't bring themselves to vote Conservative might switch to the Brexit Party, and basically, if enough people do that, then the Labour Party loses, finishing second to the Conservatives. Didn't work in Bolton South East, but it's interesting how the Brexit Party had to campaign tactically. In Chorley, the main parties didn't stand. That's because Sir Lindsay Hoyle was the sitting Speaker of the House, and it is British political tradition that the major parties do not stand against the candidate. However, the Brexit Party and the Greens did offer candidates. The Speaker won 2/3 of the vote. Turnout was just 50%. In second place was the Brexit Party candidate Mark Brexit Smith, and yes, he did legally change his name to Brexit Smith for the purposes of this election. He finished second with 24% of the vote. Leigh, which had been a Labour seat for 100 years, was Conservative, and it was Conservative by 4.2%. Now, if we look at the Brexit, the Lib Dems, the Independent candidate and the UKIP candidate, they collectively won 14% of the vote. So although these so-called third parties, these more minor parties, although it's unlikely that they're going to win a seat, what they can do is spoil the result for another party. And so where the Conservatives have won by 4%, the Labour Party can point to those third parties as the reason why they lost, because voters are not necessarily going to the Conservatives, they're just leaving the Labour Party, and that's what gives the Conservatives that victory in Leigh. And then Bury North. Bury North is very much like Bolton North East. It's one of the tightest seats in the country. The Conservatives gained from Labour. James Daly won by just 105 votes. The Lib Dems, Brexit and Green parties got 3,000 votes. And then in Bury South, this was a key campaign in Bury South. The Conservatives gained from Labour again. So both of those Bury seats went from being red to blue. The Conservatives won by 400 votes. Other candidates who weren't Conservative or Labour won 6,000 votes. Now, there were individual situations that impacted this result. The former Labour MP, Ivan Lewis, had been suspended from the Labour Party after allegations of sexual misconduct, so he decided to stand as an independent. He actually encouraged voters not to vote Labour but to vote Conservative because of the ongoing scandal within the Labour Party over the party's dealings of claims of anti-Semitism. Now, two of the largest Jewish communities in the UK are in that Bury South district, Prestwich and Whitefield. And so Jewish voters make up roughly 1 in 10 voters in Bury South. And so the issue of anti-Semitism and the handling of anti-Semitism within the Labour Party mattered significantly to those voters in Bury South. And that just goes to show that, as well as the issue of Brexit, in certain constituencies, in certain areas, there are individual issues that matter. Now, that's not to say that anti-Semitism in the Labour Party at the time only mattered in Bury South. That's not true. But it was particularly important to voters in certain areas, and Bury South was one of those. So, as I said at the start of the video, one thing that impacts results, thanks to first past the post, is you just need more than anybody else to win, which gives us some areas of the country that are very safe and unlikely to change, and then so-called battleground or swing seats like Bolton North East, like Bury North, where the result is very, very close, and that's where elections are won and lost. So let's have a look at some of those safe and swing seats from 2019. We'll start with the safe seats. So you can see there that the top 6 safest seats in 2019 were all in the northwest. 5 of those 6 seats are in Liverpool and Merseyside. They are all Labour seats. The biggest majority on this list is the 39,000 seats in Knowsley in the northwest, but the safest seat is Liverpool Walton. So what we can almost guarantee from one election to the next is that these regions will continue to vote in the way that they have. We can see every single result in that top 30 says hold. And what that means is that the party that was in control at the last election is still in control at this one. And you can see that most of the safest seats in the country in 2019 were Labour-held seats, and all the others were Conservative-held seats. And what you can also see is that the second most popular party is the opposite. So of the 20 Labour seats in our top 30 safe seat list, all of those 20, the Conservatives came second. And in the 10 Conservative seats that are safest, Labour came second. So the safest Conservative seat, with South Holland and the Deepins in the East Midlands, Conservatives finished first, Labour in second place, majority of 30,000 votes. So we get safe seats, these constituencies, these regions where the vote change is very, very unlikely from one election to the next. But then at the opposite end of the spectrum, we get the so-called swing seats or battleground seats. Now, the closest result in all of the United Kingdom is in Fermanagh and South Tyrone in Northern Ireland, where Sinn Féin kept the seat and the Ulster Unionists came second. That result was 57 votes in it. If 58 people had not voted Sinn Féin and had either not voted or voted for somebody else, the Ulster Unionists would have been in power. So the key seats that I want to pick out on this list: number 2, Bury North; number 10, Bury South; and number 11, Bolton North East. All constituencies close to our school. And what you can see is that there are very fine margins. So Bury North, the Conservatives won the seat from Labour by 105 votes. Number 10, Bury South, Conservatives won it from Labour by 400 votes. Bolton North East, the Conservatives again won it from Labour with just under 400 votes. And these are the regions of the country that are likely to change. So at the time of recording this, 2023, the Labour Party are going to target every single one of those seats in the hope that those 100 votes in Bury North or 400 votes in Bolton North East and Bury South flip from the Conservatives. And actually, the Labour Party don't necessarily need them all to vote for them. They just need those voters to vote for another party. So if we've got Reform UK, which used to be the Brexit Party, that might take some votes from Conservative voters, or the Lib Dems might pick up as well. One thing I want to point your attention to is in these top 26 seats, in our top 30 safest seats, there wasn't a single gain, there wasn't a single seat that changed hands. In this list of 26, 11 switched. So it's in these regions where election results can be won and lost. Bury and Bolton are going to be two towns that both the Labour and Conservative parties are incredibly keen to win at the next general election, because towns like Bolton and Bury are the areas that are going to decide the election. Now, I just want you to think for a minute, from an individual voter's perspective, how does that feel? Well, for me, somebody who used to live in Liverpool that now lives in Bolton North East, my vote means a lot more now. 10, 11 years ago, even if I wanted to vote Labour, my vote would have very likely not counted towards the result. Because in Liverpool, the majorities of nearly 30,000 or 30,000 or more mean that even most Labour voters, their vote doesn't count towards the result because Labour's already won the race. So from me moving from Liverpool to Bolton, as a voter, I have so much more power, especially in Bolton North East. However, the downside of living in a swing seat is, for me, living in Bolton North East, I know that for my vote to count at all, it needs to be for the Labour or the Conservative candidate. Just like in East Dunbartonshire in Scotland, SNP and Liberal Democrats came very close to one another. And so again, if you lived in that region, you know that you've got a choice of two if you want your vote to count towards the result. For me in Bolton North East, it's Labour and the Conservatives. So Green voters, Lib Dem voters, Reform voters, those people know when they go to the ballot box that if they don't vote for the Conservative or Labour parties, the chances are their vote isn't going to count whatsoever. The final thing I want to do in this video is look at what type of parliament do we get, what type of result do we get when we use first past the post. So the first thing that we get is what we call a two-party system. And you can see that nationwide, when we look at the seats won, there are two main parties, the Conservative and Labour Party, and no other party, no other group is able to challenge their dominance. Now in Scotland, up until 2019, you might actually say, well, there's not a two-party system in Scotland, there's a one-party system because the SNP control almost all seats. The Lib Dems, Labour and Conservatives win a small amount. So in Scotland, slightly different. In Northern Ireland, yeah, there's a two-party system, mostly a competition for power between the Unionist, Democratic Unionist Party and the Nationalists in Sinn Féin. But nationwide, across the whole of the UK, we get a two-party system where the Conservatives and Labour parties are the two parties with any sort of real chance of forming a government. And you can see that is reflected in voter share. What I was just saying there about living in Bolton North East affecting my voting behaviour. I know living in Bolton North East, if I don't vote Labour or Conservative, then my vote will not count towards the result of the election. And you can see that it affects voting behaviour. So we look at the Conservatives and Labour Party, 75% of voters voted Labour or Conservative across the United Kingdom. But what you might notice is that we get a bonus for the winning party. We call it the winner's bonus because it's the winning party that gets it. You can see that the Conservative Party had 365 seats, well above the 326 seats needed to win. So they've got a healthy majority of seats in the House of Commons. And a majority is 50% plus one. But you can see that the Conservatives managed to get a strong majority with only 43.5% of the vote share. So the winning party tends to get more seats than they got votes nationwide. And that's because you don't need a majority to win in a constituency. So in Bolton North East, Mark Logan wins by less than 400 votes. He's been elected with a plurality of the vote, which basically means more than anybody else, but not a majority. So when we scale that up nationwide, the winning party is able to form a majority government without winning a majority of the vote. And while we're talking about the two-party system, we can see listed there the names of some of the parties that didn't win any seats at all. The Brexit Party, which actually won a significant amount of the vote nationwide, 2% of the vote is much higher than some of the regional parties. So, for example, the Brexit Party across the whole of the UK won more votes than Sinn Féin or the Democratic Unionists because they only stand in Northern Ireland. But whereas Sinn Féin and the Democratic Unionists win seats because they're only standing in Northern Ireland, the Brexit Party didn't win any. And so parties like the Brexit Party and the Liberal Democrats, two political parties that stand nationwide and try to win votes nationwide, tend to be less likely to succeed and win seats than third parties that only sit in one particular region, like the Democratic Unionists and Sinn Féin in Northern Ireland. Because their vote is concentrated in one area, they become more likely to win individual seats. But you can see some other parties that stood and didn't win any seats. The Yorkshire Party, the Independent Group for Change, the Monster Raving Loony Party. There are other so-called third parties and minor parties that stand for election and don't win a single seat. And the final thing I want to talk about, and it's linked to the winner's bonus, is that we do not get a proportionate result in first past the post. The result and the government that we get does not reflect the vote share. So if you are the winning party or if you are a regional third party, you tend to win more seats than your vote share nationwide. And we can see that in the table there. So the Conservative Party, we've rounded their vote share up to 44%, but they won 56% of seats. So their winner's bonus was 12%. But they weren't the only other party that got more seats than their vote share nationwide. If we look at the SNP, because they're dominant in Scotland in 2019, they get 7% of the seats in the House of Commons with just 4% of the vote. So their deviation is positive. They get 3% more seats than their vote share suggested. The biggest losers in 2019, and they tend to be the biggest losers under first past the post, is the Liberal Democrats. 12% of the vote nationwide, 2% of the seats. So their distortion from proportionality, their deviation is minus 10%. They get 10% fewer seats in the House of Commons than they got vote share from the people at the ballot box in 2019. And it is no surprise that the Liberal Democrats are the party that have campaigned for decades to change the voting system, because they are punished more than any other political party. So it says at the bottom there, what would the House of Commons look like if PR had been used? And PR is proportional representation, where the vote share directly reflects the seats in the House of Commons. So you can see the Conservatives, if we used a proportional system, would have lost 80 seats. And that would have taken them below the minimum required number needed to have a majority government. They would have only won 285 seats. The biggest winners would have been the Lib Dems. They would have gained 64 seats. So what would have happened? Well, if nobody wins a majority, then the largest party, has essentially the first dibs on trying to form a coalition. So I imagine that the Conservatives, the first party they would have rung would have been the Brexit Party to get Brexit done and got their 13 seats, but that still wouldn't have been enough. So maybe they would have gone to the DUP, 6 seats from the DUP, still wouldn't have been enough. I don't imagine Labour, Lib Dem, the SNPs and the Green Party would have had anything to do with a Conservative-led coalition. So what we would have had is we would have had a crisis, because if PR had been used, the biggest party, the Conservatives, would not have formed a majority government. Even with sympathetic parties to the Brexit cause, they would not have had enough seats to form a majority. And then maybe, just maybe, if Labour, the Lib Dems, the SNP and the Green Party collect their votes together, they would have had 3-seat majority. They would have had 3 seats, 329, 3 more than the minimum needed. But that is a lot to ask for Labour, Lib Dem, SNP and Green to all come together in a 4-party coalition. And to get 4 parties in the same government all getting what they want would have been very unlikely. So one thing that First Past the Post gives us, despite all its criticisms about the 2-party system and it's not a proportional result, what we almost always get is a majority government. We don't often see in this country coalitions. Now, in some countries, coalition governments are not frowned upon at all. They are seen as a sign of political cooperation and progress. In Germany, for example, it's very common to see coalition governments, whereas in this country, coalitions are not looked upon favourably. In 2017, the Conservative campaign kept reminding voters of a coalition of chaos if the Labour Party was to win the election, a coalition of chaos led by Jeremy Corbyn. So in British politics, we don't really, in our political culture, like the idea of coalitions. In other countries, it's a good sign of parties working together in the long term. So one other thing that we get from first past the post is a clear result and a majority government, and that allows for decisive decision making to take place, because whether you like it or not, Brexit did eventually get done. Now, it wasn't as simple as Boris Johnson made it out to be. The oven-ready deal wasn't quite oven-ready. He later went on to say that that deal that he negotiated wasn't good enough and should and could be better once he was out of power. But regardless of that, the process of Brexit ended and Britain could move on from that saga. So we could say that first past the post gave us that, because it gave us a majority government.